China wants to lead a new world order, and they're using the United Nations to grab power. Welcome back to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. The United Nations. According to its website, the UN has one central mission: the maintenance of international peace and security. Well, I certainly like peace and security, don't you? And certainly it appears we've avoided another world war. And that's because the UN is supposed to be a place where all the countries around the world can work together for the benefit of everyone. But over the years, the Chinese Communist Party has been getting more and more influence over the UN, and that's already had serious consequences for the rest of the world. Joining me today is Anders Corr. He's the publisher of the Journal of Political Risk and principal at Corr Analytics. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you.
So first of all, let's talk about the latest controversy. China now has an influential position in the United Nations Human Rights Council. How did the Chinese Communist Party get in the UN body meant to monitor freedom of speech, arbitrary detention, and enforce disappearances? Is it because they're so good at those things?
Well, no, they're one of the worst at those things. They're well known as one of the world's worst human rights violators, yet they've used their influence in the UN to get that position. They trade votes, they badger people, they bribe people. It's typical carrot and stick tactics to achieve those kinds of positions for these autocratic countries.
Well, so what kind of impact might China have on the UN Human Rights Council?
Well, they're going to have a bad impact. I mean, it's exactly counter to the human rights. So, it's a big problem that they've joined. They're now already cutting down speech when if you have a human rights activist or a nonprofit organization come to speak at the Human Rights Council, they will typically try to shorten the amount of speaking time that they have. They'll try to keep people out, like they kept Dolkan Issa, who's a famous Uyghur activist and representative of the World Uyghur Congress. So they'll use every dirty trick in the book to keep human rights out of the Human Rights Council.
That's incredible. How can that be tolerated?
Well, a lot of countries, the UN is essentially run by the elites, the political elites of each country, the political leadership of each country, and political leaderships of each country are typically closely linked to the economic elites of each country. And those economic elites, of course, are making money often in China. And if they're not making money in China, then China can offer them to make money and use that leverage to influence the political elites, then to get votes to get China onto the council and other things. I mean, it's not just the council. There are many other organizations, UN organizations that China has joined. The Aviation Organization, the Industrial Development Organization. Even they tried to get onto intellectual property, which was another crazy attempt and totally counterintuitive. But they can do it because they get the votes, because they have the money.
So this isn't isolated to just any one particular UN body. This is throughout the UN.
It's throughout the UN. China can get the UN votes in the General Assembly, and that's how they vote to get people onto these committees. So they're quite influential. For example, when one country, Austria, wanted to, didn't want to vote with the UN on a particular thing or statement, and they were threatened to not be able to have their embassy in Beijing. They were trying to get land for their embassy in Beijing, and China threatened not to give them that land unless they refused to sign a particular statement in favor of the Uyghurs. And Montenegro and other countries have also received similar treatment.
So really this isn't as simple as just China saying, hey, human rights, I don't think that's not a good idea. Like, that would be too obvious. But they're really just kind of subverting the entire institution.
That's exactly right. And a lot of countries aren't very favorable to human rights either. All the authoritarian countries or quasi-authoritarian countries would just as soon keep the UN and their human rights mandate, which dates to 1948. The Universal Declaration on Human Rights has, mandates that the UN support human rights, language rights, electoral rights, essentially democracy. Yet the UN is increasingly, not doing that now that China has so much influence. Russia, North Korea, and China recently co-sponsored a UN General Assembly vote on internet sovereignty, which basically was a cover and a legitimization of their censorship of the internet, and they got that vote through the General Assembly. So they have a lot of clout. They're able to get onto a lot of positions. They have They have clout on UNESCO, and that's how politics works in the UN and the international system. UN votes are for sale.
And now you said China, Russia, and North Korea?
Correct.
North Korea.
Yes.
Well, so, like you say, when I think of the UN, I think of, it being dedicated to peace and human rights. Why is the free world allowing regimes like the Chinese Communist Party or Russia or North Korea to completely subvert the main mission of the United Nations?
It goes back to the League of Nations, which was founded in 1920, and the United Nations, when it was founded in 1945, the idea was to include the big dictatorships in the organization to try to engage them, to try to socialize them, civilize them, if you will, into being democracies over time. And they signed up to that in the early documents of the Atlantic Charter. They signed up to some of these principles: freedom of the seas, democracy, human rights. And so they indicated that they would make improvements on that, but they basically went back on their word. And over time, it's been very clear with the Soviet Union and now especially with China that these guys have no intention to democratize. In fact, just the opposite. They want to make us into authoritarian countries. They want to take our international organizations and turn them into a tool for their own use.
Is that what China's goal is?
Absolutely. They want to use the UN to promote their own global hegemony, essentially.
So what would that look like?
It would look very bad. We would see increasing loss of freedom of speech, increasing loss of democratization. If you look at the Philippines right now, it has gone through a process. It is going through a process of lack of, losing some freedoms. The press is under attack in the Philippines. The Philippines has switched alliance from the United States to China, or is sort of in the process of doing that. A lot of countries are switching their alliance with Taiwan, or recognition of Taiwan, to recognition of Beijing as the paramount power in China. And you would see countries, if China really was able to increase its influence substantially over the next 10, 20, 30 years, you might see some countries come under enough control from Beijing that they would lose rights, like the Hong Kong people are losing rights, or like the Uyghurs have lost their rights, 1 to 3 million in concentration camps there. So we don't want to go down that road. We want to make sure that China doesn't get the influence at the UN or get influence in our countries, in our capitals. And the same process can happen in Washington, D.C. or Paris or London, where businessmen that are doing business in China are used by China as levers to try to influence national level politics in our democracies.
So it's basically like a numbers game. It doesn't matter if the United States, the UK, France, and Germany are opposed to China turning the UN into something that opposes freedom of speech, for instance, as long as China gets enough other countries to back what it wants.
Yeah, I mean, there are some limitations, like the UN Security Council. The US, France, and the UK all have veto power on the UN Security Council. So there are some technical limitations, but those limitations can be overcome in time if China gets more influence and is willing to break rules that the UN has, and they've proven themselves willing to break rules all over the place. So yes, all of that can be washed away if China achieves the influence that it is trying to do, and it's in the process of that. So we really have to wake up to this problem, and remove any ability of China to influence our national politics or the politics at the UN.
Well, let's talk about China's Belt and Road Initiative, an infrastructure project that's been called colonialism with Chinese characteristics. China's gotten it officially recognized as part of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. How?
Well, they're trying to shoehorn their Belt and Road Initiative into the SDGs, by trying to make linkages, claim linkages. But in reality, what's going on is that it has nothing to do with the SDGs. The Belt and Road Initiative is, primarily to offload economic excesses that China has, whether that's they have excess infrastructure, building capacity, so they offload it to countries. In the meantime, they loan the money to buy those infrastructure projects from China. They loan out that money. So now China has something like $5 trillion of lent out money in the world. It owns $5 trillion of debt from other countries, a lot of which has gone to fund Belt and Road projects. So the money actually never leaves China. It goes from one bank account in China to another bank account in China. And a country like Sri Lanka is left holding billions of dollars of debt and maybe a port that's useless. For example, their Hambantota port. And it's so useless that it can't pay back the loans as was originally thought or was originally sold to them. And so what they have to do is, in that case, they had to lease that port back to China for 99 years. They have to pay up their collateral, and often the collateral is the project that China's been working on. And oh, by the way, that project is primarily useful for getting extracted resources from that country back to China. So it's less about actually developing things in that country that country needs in the future. For example, independent industry or independent technology companies. It's more about turning these countries that accept Belt and Road assistance into mercantile sort of satrap nations that have to then depend on resource exports or agricultural exports. This is exactly what China sees itself in the world. It wants to see itself as the industrial and technological global hub of the world, with all other countries feeding it natural resources and feeding it agriculture, and then getting back in return finished goods that China itself manufactures. And that way, China is always on top economically, China is always on top technologically and industrially. And when that's the case, all other countries essentially lose not only economic influence and sovereignty, but they lose military influence and sovereignty, because if you don't have an industrial base, if you don't have a technological base, your military is worthless.
Yeah, it really sounds like it aligns with the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. So,
Right.
I think a lot of people are beginning to realize China's power in the UN thanks to the World Health Organization. So the Chinese regime has gotten it to praise China's coronavirus response, shut out Taiwan, and attack critics of the party. Now, the US was the largest donor to the WHO. China only counted for a fraction of a percent of the budget. So clearly, China isn't just buying influence. How is it getting the WHO to do its bidding?
Well, Dr. Tedros came on in 2017. When he put his name forward as a candidate to become the head of WHO, China supported him. Ethiopia had already had billions of dollars of Chinese investment in the country, so already China had a lever on Dr. Tedros. Then Dr. Tedros comes through and he starts supporting the Belt and Road Initiative back in 2017 when he first got in, and he was supporting what's known as the Silk Road, the Health Silk Road, or something like that, which China is now pushing after COVID-19. So he has had levers on him, and the question is, in many people's minds, what is he? Is he personally getting something out of this, or is he just responding to his leadership back in Ethiopia, who's putting leverage on it? There are cases where a UN official, the president of the UN General Assembly, John Ash, was caught being bribed by a Chinese company. This is a $1 million bribe, and the bribe was to get him to put in a UN convention center in Macau, which is owned by China. So when he was caught, he, of course, was put under FBI control. He basically was in court, and the FBI was on him, and he was, I think, going to give information on the Chinese in court, and he mysteriously died under a barbell in his apartment, and that to me is quite suspicious. So you see the kind of carrot and stick approach encapsulated in poor President John Ash of the UN General Assembly, who initially took the carrots. When he got caught, he got the stick in a big way.
Yeah, he was like, I heard, like a 60-year-old man at that point, and like the day before this big trial, he was found, they first thought he died of a heart attack, then they ruled that his throat was crushed by a barbell. It's a little strange, don't you think?
Likely story.
Yeah. The source of China's power really comes from, as you mentioned, it being on the UN Security Council. A lot of people might not know this, but the People's Republic of China wasn't always in that position. Do you want to tell us a little bit about how China found itself, the Chinese Communist Party found itself in that position?
Well, back in the 50s, the UN was actually in a war with North Korea and with China in order to protect South Korea from prior North Korean invasion. And in the 1960s, the U.S. was going through the Vietnam War. We were having a hard time, and Nixon and Kissinger, by the end of that, in the early 70s, were deciding that the Vietnamese guerrillas were being funded in part and supplied and helped by the Chinese and the Russians, and so the Kissinger and Nixon decided that it might help to engage with China and try to turn China against Russia. At least that's the official story. So they in 1971 and 1972, they engaged and they opened up to China. Then over the next few years, that decade in the 70s, they let China into the UN, and they essentially got Taiwan kicked out. And it's a very sad situation in a way, because Taiwan was a U.S. ally at the time. They weren't a democracy, but they were a U.S. ally. And then in the 80s and early 90s, Taiwan democratized. So if we had actually kept Taiwan in the UN rather than let in China, and then after we let China into the UN, we let them into the World Trade Organization, which gave them trading access to the whole world. It legitimated them, and all of a sudden, China went from being a pariah nation to being a global player. And then, in 1989, they briefly had the situation with the Tiananmen Square, where they killed thousands of civilian democracy protesters. And so there was a very, very brief moment, where they were again a pariah state, but that only lasted maybe a few months or a year or something. And then all the world leaders wanted to start doing business with them again. And then in the 90s and 2000s, the business started increasing. Their military expenditures started rapidly increasing. We should have known at that point that it was a very bad idea to continue engaging China. We were only empowering them to do bad things, and they were clearly bad actors because they had killed their own democracy protesters. And then in 2008, when we had the financial crash in the U.S., China really sensed blood, and they started thinking they were on top of the world. So between 2008 and now, they've now started really grabbing territory, Scarborough Shoal, other places. I mean, they'd already done it in 95. They grabbed Mischief Reef in the South China Sea. But this just continued, and their power increased and their influence increased. They start funding U.S. universities, European universities, giving them huge donations. They start bringing U.S. military guys all to China to do boondoggles and trips, and supposedly under the training, to do training, and even congressmen they bring back to China to supposedly do training. Professors, they bring them back. So their influence just increased massively. And then they started giving all these sweetheart deals to some of our biggest billionaires, whether it's Schwartzman or Bloomberg or any number of guys. And the guys who are on the outside, like Facebook for a while, those guys want to get in because it's a huge market. It's a quarter of the world's economy or something like that. And they all want into that market. And so they're willing to do a lot, including, I would argue, represent China and essentially lobby for China with the highest levels of U.S. government. And so and this isn't just happening in the U.S. This is happening all over the world. When Prime Minister David Cameron left office from in the UK, he went and he started lobbying for China, promoting the Belt and Road Initiative. So, it's a real problem. And Kevin Rudd of Australia, former Prime Minister of Australia, also very pandering to China publicly in his speech. And his daughter makes a lot of money in China. So you have a real problem of economic linkages between Western democratized political elites and Chinese business. And that is what is causing the lack of a response, the lack of a defense to China as it expands its territory and influence.
So it's not just the UN.
It's not just the UN. We got it right in D.C.
Well, all right, so time for some moral equivalency. What's the difference between how the U.S. uses the UN to push its agenda and China's?
Well, I think the U.S., because it's a democracy, has always promoted democracy and human rights around the world. There are cases when the U.S. Will ally with another country that's not a democracy or do things that are not really consistent with human rights. But I would argue that those are almost always in support of a long-term goal of democracy, whether that is fighting the Vietnamese in Vietnam or fighting the Taliban in Afghanistan or going to war with Iraq. Iraq had just invaded Kuwait and might have been building nuclear weapons. So there's always been a higher democratic or human rights or stabilize the international system goal behind any transgressions that the United States might have caused. China, on the other hand, is grabbing territory from countries that are poorer than itself, like Vietnam and the Philippines. They're taking oil and gas from those countries. They're taking fishing rights from those countries. And so it's totally inconsistent with their stated goal of being even a communist country. They're not at all. They're not actually a communist country. It's a very aggressive capitalist country that's a dictatorship that's trying to become the next world emperor. Become the first world emperor, really.
Well, I was going to ask if there's anything other countries can do, but it seems like China has pretty much bought off all the countries to some extent. So how about this? Is there anything that the small number of people who haven't been bought off by the Chinese Communist Party, is there anything they can do about China's power grab?
Well, I think one thing that people can do is they can try to sever the link between China's money and our politicians. And the way to do that, because China's money goes through U.S. corporations, usually the biggest ones, is to either sever the entire economy. So that's the idea of decoupling the U.S. economy from China entirely, which would work to sever the link. Another way to do it would be to improve campaign finance laws. So not allow countries or politicians to get funded by foreign countries, even through corporations that are doing business abroad. So if you have a big corporation like Bloomberg that's doing a lot of business in China, then he has a conflict of interest. He shouldn't be able to fund his own campaign. B, he shouldn't be able to fund other campaigns. Now that runs into legal issues with freedom of speech, but I would argue that we shouldn't allow money to increase the freedom of speech that some individual has. Every person, every citizen should have an equal right to speech, and that means that no person is able to unfairly expand the strength of their speech with their billions of dollars.
Well, thank you very much for joining me today. If somebody watching would like to learn more about you or your work, where should they go?
You can find me at Twitter or Facebook under Anders Corr, all one word.
Well, thanks again for joining me.
Thank you, Chris.
And thank you for watching. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. See you next time.